On Thursday, Bradley Robert Edwards was found guilty of murdering 2 young women in the mid-1990s. The judge at his trial said it was likely he also killed a 3rd woman.
For 3 years in the mid-1990s, young women vanished from the streets of Claremont, an inner-city nightlife hub in Western Australia. Each disappearance began the same way: a routine night out, a walk toward a taxi, and then complete silence. The searches stretched across suburbs, highways, and bushland, with no clear suspect and no link strong enough to explain how the attacks were happening. As investigators compared timelines, phone records, and witness sightings, the mystery evolved into one of the most critical and unsettling cases in Western Australia. 3 women, 3 separate nights, and no trace of who had taken them or why. Tonight, we follow the inquiry that began with a single missing person report and grew into one of Australia's longest and most complex investigations.
You are watching Crime Insider. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop a like on the video.
When 18-year-old Ciara Spiers stepped out into the warm air of a January night in 1996, her plans were simple: end an evening with friends in Claremont and head home to Mosman Park. According to police reports, she left Club Bayview shortly after 2 a.m. and walked toward the nearby taxi stand. The area was busy enough that no one considered her movements unusual. Dozens of young people were making the same walk every weekend. Ciara reached a public phone box at the corner of Stirling Highway and Stirling Road and requested a taxi. Dispatch records later confirmed that the call lasted only seconds. She gave her pickup point, agreed to wait, and hung up. Nothing in her voice suggested urgency or concern. That call became the final confirmed contact she made. When the taxi arrived minutes later, the driver saw an empty footpath. There was no sign of Ciara, and no one nearby appeared to be looking for her. According to the company's records, the driver circled once before marking the job abandoned. At that moment, nothing pointed to a crime. People changed their minds and found other ways home all the time. By morning, Ciara's family grew concerned when she failed to answer calls. She had a consistent routine and rarely disappeared without notice. Her mother contacted police before noon, providing details of her clothing, her planned route, and the places she had visited that night. Officers began the initial missing person checks, hospitals, nearby lockups, and friends' homes, but found no trace of her. Witness accounts gathered over the next 48 hours offered only fragments. A small group waiting near the taxi rank recalled seeing Ciara moments before the call, but their memories differed on who else was nearby. Another witness described a light-colored vehicle pulling over near the intersection, though the make and model were unclear. According to the early tasking logs, no one could say for certain whether Ciara entered a vehicle willingly, reluctantly, or at all. As the first week passed, officers expanded the search radius. Mosman bushland, walking trails, and coastline areas were surveyed. Door-to-door inquiries were completed across multiple suburbs. With every step, the urgency increased. Ciara's disappearance no longer looked like a miscommunication or a spontaneous change in plans. It now resembled a targeted abduction, one carried out quickly, without noise, and without leaving visible evidence. By February, detectives logged dozens of interviews, reviewed taxi data, and examined phone booth records, but found no lead substantial enough to direct the investigation forward. The absence of physical evidence made the case unusually difficult. There were no discarded belongings, no items left in the surrounding area, and no confirmed vehicle sightings strong enough to pursue. Ciara's family, supported by the wider Perth community, made public appeals for information. Posters were displayed around Claremont and Mosman Park. Volunteers joined searches, yet the case stalled almost immediately, with investigators unable to identify who last stood beside her or why the contact ended so suddenly. That silence set the foundation for everything that came next. And within months, police would face a second disappearance, one that shifted the case into a new category and forced investigators to reconsider how quickly danger could strike in the same small district. When 23-year-old Jane Rimmer disappeared on the night of 9 June 1996, investigators recognized the parallels quickly. Like Sarah, Jane had spent the evening in Claremont, moving between the area's popular hotels and bars. According to witness statements later released in court, Jane and her friends visited the Ocean Beach Hotel before heading toward the Continental Hotel, a familiar gathering spot for young locals. As the night wound down, her friends decided to leave. Jane stayed outside the Continental, smiling as she told them she would be fine waiting alone. CCTV footage from that night, now widely known, showed her standing on the footpath at 12:04 a.m., glancing briefly towards someone off-camera. That recording captured the final image of her alive. Hours later, when her family couldn't reach her, a new missing person report was filed. Officers were immediately struck by the similarities. A young woman, alone in Claremont, last seen close to midnight, and then complete silence. Patrol units rechecked nightlife venues, taxi ranks, and nearby service roads. Nothing suggested a disturbance, and no one recalled hearing anything unusual. For several weeks, the case remained in the same uncertain phase as Sarah's. Investigators reviewed timetables, gathered statements from patrons, and examined bus and taxi routes for potential contact points. Yet none of the leads gave clarity to where Jane had gone or who she might have encountered. Everything changed on August 3, 1996, when a family searching for wildflowers near Wellard, more than 40 kilometers south of Claremont, discovered a body in bushland. Police sealed the area and conducted a full search grid. According to forensic reports tendered years later, the remains were located near a track not commonly used by locals, suggesting the offender selected an isolated site. Within days, the body was identified as Jane Rimmer through dental comparison. Detectives now had a confirmed homicide linked to a disappearance that shared striking similarities with Sarah's case. The injuries documented in the post-mortem indicated a violent assault, and clothing was missing from the scene, consistent with the offender removing items. This discovery forced investigators to shift strategy. Instead of treating each disappearance independently, they began mapping both cases side by side. They noted the close proximity of the nightlife venues, the near-identical time windows, the victims' profiles, and the lack of witnesses. The pattern was too strong to dismiss. Task force logs from that period show how quickly police resources increased. Officers canvassed Claremont again, reviewing lighting, taxi access points, and footpath routes. They interrogated whether the offender used a vehicle, and if so, where he could have parked without attracting attention. Reports from women who felt uneasy in the area were re-examined. Multiple persons of interest were interviewed, though no one emerged as a definitive suspect. The community response was immediate. Fear spread through Claremont's nightlife scene. Women stopped walking alone. Taxi usage increased, and groups became more cautious about separating late at night. The idea that two disappearances and one confirmed murder could occur in the same small district in less than 6 months created an atmosphere of heightened anxiety. Police now faced mounting pressure. They had 2 major investigations running in parallel, and the connection between them grew stronger with each passing day. Still, without a suspect or forensic breakthrough, the cases remained open-ended. By March 1997, nightlife in Claremont carried a tension no one could ignore. The disappearances of Sarah Spiers and Jane Rimmer remained unsolved, and both cases had left investigators without a clear offender, vehicle description, or forensic trail. Patrols increased. Officers moved through laneways and car parks each weekend, yet the streets remained vulnerable, and the offender remained hidden. On the night of 14 March 1997, 27-year-old Ciara Glennon, a young lawyer, joined friends for after-work drinks to celebrate the end of a demanding week. According to witness statements later presented in court, Ciara left the Continental Hotel shortly before midnight. She declined a ride, telling friends she would find a taxi on Sterling Highway, as she had many times before. Her movements from that point were reconstructed through accounts from passing motorists and patrons in the area. Multiple people later reported seeing a woman matching her description walking along Sterling Highway. None recalled anyone approaching her or causing concern. Nothing suggested an immediate threat. But by the next morning, Ciara failed to attend planned family events. Relatives filed a missing person report that afternoon, prompting police to launch a search that echoed the efforts from the previous 2 cases. Officers checked taxi logs, public transport records, and roadside CCTV from nearby businesses. They found nothing definitive. This disappearance shifted the investigation into a critical phase. All 3 women had last been seen alone at nights, walked near Claremont nightlife venues, vanished without a trace, and left no physical evidence at the scene. Reports of suspicious vehicles and men approaching women were logged and analyzed. Still, no sighting connected clearly to Ciara's last known position. On 3 April 1997, a bushwalker discovered a body in dense scrubland off Pippedini Road in Eglinton, more than 40 kilometers north of Claremont. The area was isolated, similar to where Jane had been found. Forensic teams secured the scene, documenting tire impressions, vegetation disturbance, and clothing placement. Dental comparison later confirmed the remains as Ciara Glennon. Marks documented during the post-mortem suggested a violent struggle. Investigators noted scratches on Ciara's arms and hands, signs of defensive efforts. Under her fingernails, preserved in scrapings taken at the scene, forensic biologists later identified foreign DNA. This detail, although not immediately conclusive, would become one of the most significant breakthroughs in Western Australian criminal history. Ciara's discovery hardened the investigative direction. Police publicly stated that the 3 cases were linked and that a serial offender was operating in the region. It marked the first time officials openly acknowledged what the public had feared for months. At this stage, detectives had 3 victims, 3 crime scenes, and years of work ahead of them. The investigation soon expanded into one of the largest in the nation, and the search for the Claremont serial killer began in earnest. In May 1997, Western Australia Police launched Task Force Macro, a specialized investigative body dedicated solely to identifying the Claremont offender. It became one of the most extensive operations in the state's history, consuming thousands of hours, involving hundreds of officers, and generating millions of documents. The task force began by mapping every known detail of the women's final movements. Investigators reconstructed venue locations, taxi ranks, lighting conditions, and access routes. They reviewed phone booth logs, vehicle movements, and statements from patrons who had been near Sarah, Jane, or Ciara on the nights they disappeared. Using early behavioral analysis models, experts outlined probable characteristics of the offender, suggesting someone familiar with the Claremont area who could move quickly without drawing attention. Officers also examined unsolved assaults and suspicious incidents dating back several years. Notably, reports from women who had been approached late at night near Claremont were reevaluated. Patrol logs revealed multiple accounts of a man offering lifts to women walking alone. Some accepted briefly before requesting to get out due to his behavior. Others described near-miss incidents that mirrored the conditions under which the 3 victims disappeared. As the months progressed, Task Force Macro identified several persons of interest. Some were eliminated quickly. Others remained under surveillance for years. According to court records, detectives used covert monitoring, phone intercepts, and vehicle tracking in the hope of identifying someone whose movements aligned with the cases. Yet none provided the certainty investigators needed. Thousands of taxis were examined. Drivers were interviewed repeatedly. Vehicles were inspected for fiber traces, unusual wear, or signs of interior cleaning. The task force also examined men with access to isolated bushland, as well as those with histories of violence or stalking. No single suspect matched all criteria. Forensic evidence remained limited. The DNA found under Ciara's fingernails did not match anyone in the national database at the time. Hair and fiber samples collected from Jane's body could not be linked conclusively to a suspect. Without a matching profile, the investigation relied heavily on behavioral inferences and public information. By the early 2000s, frustration built inside the task force. They had amassed massive volumes of files, but no path led directly to the offender. Public attention waned, but community concern persisted. Families of the victims continued to participate in appeals, hoping someone would come forward with a new detail or old memory.
Meanwhile, the offender remained unidentified, living quietly somewhere in Western Australia, unknown to the public and law enforcement.
For nearly a decade, Task Force Macro worked without a definitive lead. That changed when officers revisited older, unresolved cases involving attacks on women from the early 1990s. One of those cases involved a 1995 assault at Hollywood Hospital staff accommodation. The victim, a young woman, reported being grabbed from behind by a man who attempted to restrain her. She fought back, and the offender fled. According to police archives, the incident left behind crucial evidence, a DNA sample obtained from the victim's clothing. At the time, the technology could not link it to a suspect. Macro investigators revisited the sample using updated forensic methods. The testing produced a full profile, one that matched the DNA found under Ciara Glennon's fingernails. After years of uncertainty, the task force finally had a scientific connection between two crimes. Detectives built a timeline from the Hollywood assault forward, cross-referencing staff, contractors, and volunteers. One of the men who appeared in records from that period was Bradley Robert Edwards, a telecommunications technician who had been working at the hospital at the time of the assault. The more investigators looked at Edwards, the more aligned he seemed with the Claremont timeline. Additional reports surfaced from a 1988 assault in which a woman had been attacked inside her Huntingdale home by an intruder wearing a disguise. According to forensic documents, a piece of fabric from the offender's costume had been left behind, containing a partial DNA sample. Modern testing matched that sample to the same profile linked to the 1995 attack and Ciara's defensive scratches. 3 separate offenses, spanning nearly a decade, now pointed to one man. This convergence marked the first time Task Force Macro could attribute the Claremont cases to a specific individual based on physical evidence rather than inference. Detectives intensified their scrutiny of Edwards, mapping his work routes, previous addresses, vehicle history, and proximity to known crime sites. Forensic analysts also re-examined fibers collected from Ciara and Jane's clothing. These fibers were compared to material found in vehicles accessible to Edwards during the 1990s. According to prosecution filings, the fibers were consistent with those from a specific model of Telstra-issued work car, a type Edwards regularly used. Piece by piece, investigators built a cumulative picture. A man whose employment gave him access to suburbs across Perth, who worked irregular hours, who moved comfortably through residential areas at night, and whose DNA had now surfaced in connection with 2 violent assaults and the final Claremont homicide. The question was no longer whether police had a person of interest, it was how to gather enough evidence to make an arrest that could withstand scrutiny in court. This led Task Force Macro into one of the most extensive covert monitoring operations in Western Australian history, one that would eventually result in a decisive breakthrough. With DNA pointing toward Bradley Edwards as the most viable suspect, Task Force Macro began a structured surveillance operation in 2016. According to court testimony, officers monitored his movements, reviewed his digital history, and tracked his work routes. The aim was to verify whether his routines, locations, and behavioral patterns aligned with the detailed reconstructions of the Claremont cases. Detectives assessed Edwards' employment timeline first. During the mid-1990s, he had worked as a Telstra technician, frequently traveling alone at night to service communications infrastructure. This allowed him unrestricted access to suburban areas, including those between Claremont and the bushland locations where Jane and Ciara were later found. The role also provided access to company vehicles, the same type linked to fiber evidence collected from the victims. Officers then turned to his personal history. Edwards had married twice, with both relationships experiencing long-term strain. Court findings later revealed that his first marriage ended shortly after he was discovered inside another woman's bedroom, an incident he claimed was a misunderstanding, but which investigators later considered significant. The reasoning was simple. It demonstrated his willingness to enter homes covertly, echoing details from the 1988 Huntingdale assault. Detectives also explored whether Edwards had any documented behavioral changes during the years of the Claremont crimes. Colleagues described him as quiet, focused, and technically skilled, but rarely social. According to employer records, he showed no signs of distress or instability during the periods when the three women disappeared, a detail prosecutors later argued reflected an offender capable of compartmentalizing violent behavior. As surveillance deepened, officers sought a fresh DNA sample to conclusively match the historical profile. In late 2016, they obtained one from an item Edwards had handled. Forensic analysis confirmed what investigators feared. The DNA matched the profile found under Ciara Glennon's fingernails and those linked to earlier assaults. Once that confirmation arrived, the case progressed rapidly. Detectives drafted warrant applications, outlined the fiber and DNA evidence, and prepared for a coordinated arrest. The scale of the operation reflected the magnitude of the investigation. 2 decades of unsolved disappearances, thousands of witness statements, and immense public pressure. On 22 December 2016, police executed the arrest at Edwards's Keywaldale home. According to arresting officers, he did not resist. The search that followed uncovered additional items for forensic analysis, including work equipment, clothing, and historical personal belongings. Vehicles he had access to during the 1990s were also re-examined. Police formally laid the charges that same day: the abduction and murder of Jane Rimmer, the abduction and murder of Ciara Glennon, and multiple earlier offenses, including the 1988 Huntingdale assault and the 1995 Hollywood hospital attack. Investigators still lacked physical evidence tying him directly to Sarah Spiers, whose body has never been found. Despite circumstantial connections, prosecutors determined they could not meet the evidentiary threshold to charge him with her murder. The arrest ended a 20-year chapter of uncertainty, but it was only the beginning of the legal process that would determine whether the forensic trail was strong enough to convict him.
When Bradley Robert Edwards appeared in court, the proceedings immediately became one of the most closely watched trials in Western Australian history. Prosecutors relied on a combination of forensic advances, fiber analysis, behavioral evidence, and decades of investigative work. With no eyewitnesses and no confession, the state's case depended on whether the scientific data could withstand rigorous scrutiny. The DNA evidence formed the core foundation. Prosecutors outlined how the profile recovered from Ciara Glennon's fingernails matched Edwards at every tested location. Forensic biologists explained that Ciara's defensive wounds indicated a violent struggle, increasing the likelihood that the offender transferred biological trace material directly to her hands. The same DNA profile linked Edwards to the 1995 Hollywood hospital assault, tying the Claremont timeline to his earlier offending. Prosecutors then presented fiber evidence, a complex component derived from thousands of microscopic comparisons. According to expert testimony, fibers found on both Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon were consistent with those from the seats of a 1990s Telstra-issued Holden Commodore, a model Edwards regularly used for work. Forensic analysts reconstructed the fiber families, color variations, and manufacturing origins, concluding that the likelihood of those fibers appearing coincidentally was extremely low. The state also introduced evidence from the 1988 Huntingdale attack, including a DNA sample from a makeshift disguise the offender left behind. Modern testing confirmed that Edwards was the contributor. Prosecutors argued that the Huntingdale break-in, the Hollywood assault, and the Claremont murders reflected a pattern of escalating behavior, entering homes, attacking women, and eventually abducting victims from public areas. To support this argument, they presented behavioral testimony, noting Edwards' familiarity with suburban streets, late-night work schedules, and capacity to move unnoticed through residential zones. They emphasized that he lived and worked near key areas relevant to the case, including Claremont and the bushland where the victims were later found. The defense challenged each point individually. They argued that DNA under Ciara's nails could have been transferred indirectly, though prosecutors countered that her defensive injury showed immediate physical contact. They questioned the reliability of fiber analysis, citing the number of Telstra vehicles in circulation during the 1990s. They also highlighted Edwards' lack of criminal history during the period of the Claremont murders, portraying him as a quiet, unremarkable man unlikely to commit violent acts. The trial lasted months with extensive scientific presentations and witness examinations. Every component, from Telstra car seat fibers to historical employment rosters, was dissected in detail. Without a jury, the outcome rested solely on the presiding judge, who had to evaluate not only technical evidence, but also patterns of behavior, opportunity, and forensic consistency. As closing submissions began, prosecutors described the case as a layered, cumulative structure. No single detail stood alone. Instead, the DNA, fibers, prior assaults, and geographic alignments created a unified narrative pointing to one individual. The defense maintained their position that the evidence was circumstantial and that doubt remained. When the trial ended, the judge withdrew to examine years of data, testimony, and scientific findings, a task that reflected the magnitude of the case.
On 24 September 2020, the Supreme Court of Western Australia delivered its decision. The judge found Bradley Robert Edwards guilty of the murders of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon. He was acquitted of the murder of Sarah Spiers not due to exonerating evidence, but because prosecutors could not meet the threshold required without a body or definitive forensic material. In the ruling, the judge described the DNA recovered from Ciara's fingernails as scientifically compelling and the fiber evidence as highly persuasive. The Huntingdale and Hollywood attacks were deemed relevant in demonstrating Edwards' pattern of behavior and capacity for opportunistic violence. The court concluded that the combination of scientific and circumstantial evidence formed a strong, coherent case. During sentencing, prosecutors described the murders as deliberate, targeted acts carried out with planning and control. Edwards was given a life sentence with a minimum non-parole period of 40 years, one of the longest imposed in Western Australian legal history. The verdict brought a measure of closure, but not resolution. The Spiers family, who had waited more than 2 decades for answers, expressed ongoing grief. Without the discovery of Sarah's remains, the unanswered questions remained painful. Police confirmed that the investigation into her disappearance would remain open, and they continued encouraging anyone with information to come forward. Public reaction echoed a mixture of relief and reflection. For many in Western Australia, the Claremont case had spanned their entire adult lives, from the night Sarah vanished in 1996 to the final verdict 24 years later. The case reshaped policing in the state, prompting new forensic investment, expanded DNA databases, and revised investigative frameworks for long-term unsolved crimes. Within law enforcement, the successful conviction validated the persistence of Task Force Macro, despite years of criticism. Officers involved described the outcome as a testament to forensic science, evolving technology, and the determination of investigative teams who refused to let the case go cold. The community in Claremont gradually returned to a sense of normalcy, but the memory of the disappearances still lingered. The case became a lasting reminder of vulnerability in seemingly safe areas, and how dangerous individuals can exploit routine gaps in everyday life. Edwards remained in prison with no prospect of release until he is in his 80s. The families of Jane and Ciara expressed gratitude that justice had been delivered, though the sentence could not undo the years of loss. As the chapter closed, one truth shaped every reflection. The Claremont murders changed Western Australia's understanding of safety, forensic investigation, and the quiet persistence required to solve complex crimes. And even decades later, the unresolved disappearance of Sarah Spiers continues to anchor the case in both mystery and unresolved sorrow.
Even after the verdict, one part of the Claremont case remained unresolved: the disappearance of 18-year-old Sarah Spiers. Her body had never been found, and without physical evidence tying her final movements to Bradley Edwards, prosecutors could not proceed with a charge. Yet investigators remained convinced that her case belonged within the same sequence of crimes. In the years following Edwards' conviction, Western Australia police continued reviewing intelligence related to Sarah's final night. According to public statements from senior officers, the search area shifted multiple times as new information and environmental analysis emerged. Bushland knew the Darling Scarp,
Former work sites connected to Edwards' Telstra routes and undeveloped rural tracts were all examined. None provided conclusive results. Detectives revisited the taxi records from the night Ciara called for transport. They reevaluated witness accounts, noting again the report of a light-colored vehicle stopping near the phone box. The sighting was not detailed enough to identify a model or plate, but investigators continued to consider it relevant. Given Edwards' historical access to Telstra sedans, the description aligned broadly with vehicles he may have used, though this connection remained circumstantial. In later interviews, task force representatives explained that the absence of a body restricted almost every forensic pathway. Without remains, they could not establish injury type, disposal location, or post-offense movement. The landscape itself added difficulty. Perth's outer regions include vast bushland and sand tracts that can conceal evidence for decades. Still, the search persisted. Officers conducted targeted digs, drone sweeps, and ground-penetrating radar surveys when credible information surfaced. None led to Ciara. Family appeals continued as well. Ciara's parents made multiple public statements emphasizing that closure depended on locating her. They asked anyone with long-buried knowledge to come forward, reinforcing that no detail was too small. Police maintained an open posture. They confirmed that the case was not closed and that any discovery, even years after the fact, would be treated with urgency. While the conviction of Edwards addressed 2 of the Claremont murders, Ciara's disappearance remained an active part of Western Australia's unresolved cases. As the state acknowledged the conclusion of the major trial, this unanswered question continued to find the emotional core of the Claremont story, a reminder that some aspects of long-form investigations do not resolve neatly even when the offender has been identified and imprisoned.
Officers involved later described how the case informed new protocols for serial offending, data organization, and interagency cooperation. The introduction of improved forensic databases and streamlined investigative tools followed in its wake. For the public, the case altered perceptions of safety in nightlife areas. Claremont had been viewed as secure, familiar, and relatively predictable. The disappearances revealed vulnerabilities in those assumptions. Women who went out with friends, followed routine paths, and planned for taxis still became vulnerable targets. This reality sparked broader conversations about urban safety, late-night transport, and community vigilance. The families of Jane Rimmer and Ciara Glennon expressed gratitude for the verdict, acknowledging the years of work invested by investigators and the support they received from the community. Yet their statements also conveyed lasting grief, a recognition that while justice was delivered, the loss endured. For the Spiers family, the outcome was more complicated. The conviction of Edwards offered some validation, but the absence of Ciara's remains prevented full resolution. Their appeals for information continued after the trial, supported by police and community members who believed that answers could still emerge. Edwards' sentence, life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 40 years, ensured he would not re-enter the community. Prosecutors described him as a calculated offender who had acted without leaving immediate evidence, relying on isolated locations and the quiet moments between public spaces. His conviction underscored the capacity of forensic science to bridge decades and rebuild events that once seemed impossible to solve. As Western Australia reflected on the case, one takeaway became clear. Long-standing investigations require patience, evolving tools, and unwavering attention to detail. The Claremont murders spanned generations, and their resolution demonstrated how persistence can eventually break through even the most challenging mysteries. In the end, the case left a dual legacy: justice achieved for 2 families and an ongoing search for answers for the third. It reminded the public that modern forensic work continues to change the landscape of crime investigation, yet also that some questions remain beyond reach until new evidence emerges. The Claremont story became a lasting chapter in Australia's criminal history, not just because of the crimes themselves,
but because of the determination to uncover the truth, no matter how long it takes.